Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's Research Tuesdays event, Notifications from Nature. My name is Professor Laura Parry, and I'm the Interim Executive Dean of the Faculty of Sciences here at the University of Adelaide, and I'm your MC for tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Tonight we'll enjoy the final Research Tuesdays lecture for the year, Notifications from Nature. Our speaker will deliver a short presentation followed by a Q&A session. And thank you to all of those who have submitted a question with your registration. We will answer some of these. But I'd like to encourage all our viewers tonight to continue to submit questions during the presentation via the QA section down at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to officially welcome your speaker for tonight, Professor Andy Lowe, the university's Director of Food Innovation, a former Head of Science within the South Australian Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources, and a past Director of the South Australian Museum. Professor Lowe has had a very successful academic career. He was made a full professor in 2006, 9 years after obtaining his PhD in plant evolutionary biology from the University of St Andrews in the UK. At the University of Adelaide, Professor Lowe leads a group of over 30 scientists. He's been awarded over $40 million in grant funding and has published nearly 250 scientific papers. He has supervised, mentored and trained over 70 scientific, technical and postdoctoral staff and graduated 31 PhD students. He's collaborated with over 300 researchers from 100 institutes in 30 countries. Importantly, Professor Lowe is passionate about communicating science. It gives me great pleasure to ask Professor Lowe to join me on stage to start the night.
Thanks so much, Laura, and it's great to be here this evening. Notifications from nature. I thought what we'd do tonight is go through a bit of a story, about how we understand nature. We understand there are problems with nature, but also what are some of those solutions and how can technology help support our understanding and finding those solutions. So I'm afraid I'm going to start with some bad news. You can get a number of reports from the Food and Agriculture Organisation, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and this is the latest one from the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. We're used to hearing this type of message of nature is declining, species extinction is increasing, but rather positively, it's not too late to make a difference if we start now at a local and global level. So what can we do to make a difference at that kind of level? First of all, I think it's worth unpacking what ecosystem services are. It's a bit of an unknown term, and they've been rebranded as benefits from nature. And there's a whole swathe of things we get for free from nature by nature being there. I mean, we get food, we derive a lot of medicines from our natural environment, fresh water, clean air, carbon sequestration, pollination services, and a whole range of other tangible and intangible benefits. We get benefits from spending time in nature. We feel better and we often get a physical improvement as well. So those benefits from nature have been categorised into provisioning, regulating, supporting, and those cultural benefits. So just bear in mind some of those benefits that we get from nature, as I'll be coming back to that later on in the talk. So those are some of the things at risk. So where are most of the challenges being faced with nature? So this is a recent publication. Jean-François Bastin looked at the forested areas around the world and the threats posed to those over the next 30 years. And we really see that the key areas under threat are the tropical rainforest areas in Brazil, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia. But there is a positive story. We're likely to see some reforestation or some habitat renewal in the northern latitude areas. And again, I'll come on to that later in the talk. So just remember, tropical systems are most at risk. Now in the talk, I'm going to take a medical analogy. I'm going to look at how we diagnose the problems with nature, how we potentially prevent some of those problems, and how we treat those potentially to arrive at a cure. And I'm going to talk about some of the applications of technology to allow us to do that. Now, I think in the description of the talk, it was really more around the technological focus, but I thought I'd twist it round a bit to really focus on what we can understand about nature and the solutions for that using technology. So first of all, diagnosis. So we've spent probably about the last 10 years establishing this research observatory for Australia called the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. Before the establishment of this system, states and territories within Australia had to look at the condition of their ecosystems separately, and they actually used different methods to bring that analysis together. So for the first time 10 years ago, we were able to define a consistent methodology across the different states and territories to really come up with a picture of how Australia's systems are changing today. This is one of the components of TERN, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. It's the ecosystem surveillance system. There are over 750 sites across Australia that are now monitored for their condition, looking at condition of the vegetation that's there, the condition of the soils, and we have collections of thousands of samples taken from these sites which allow us to understand those systems. We understand now what are the carbon dynamics and stocks at those sites, how are those changing, what kind of invasive species we're getting into those sites, how the structure of the vegetation is changing, what the biodiversity is at the sites, and I could go on and talk about that all night, but I'm not going to. I'll give you hopefully some confidence there's a large amount of information there. But through this type of investigation, we actually have been able to find a number of new species, and some of these types of infrastructures are really important for also understanding our biodiversity and our ecosystems within the global context. And this infrastructure has allowed a global assessment of forest cover, and the first time this has been done in the world. And one of the interesting things it allowed us to do, so using satellite imagery, we're able to look and focus in on example areas of example ecosystems, count the density of the trees in that location, and that would give a good indication of the forest status there. But importantly, these sites allow the ground truthing of that estimation. So that study came up with this map. The green areas in the map are areas that have been previously classified as grassland or shrubland, but through this analysis have now been reclassified as forest. So in effect, we discovered huge areas of forest around the world using this infrastructure, and roughly it's an area about the size of Australia that was discovered that was previously classified as grassland or woodland. So one of the things to really emphasize about this is even though we're in 2020, we're still finding out about our natural world. We still haven't fully mapped it. We still don't know all the species that are out there. We haven't named those species. We haven't even discovered most of the species that are out there. We still have a lot of gaps within our knowledge, but we're starting to make real inroads to understand the basis of that information. So we're starting to diagnose some of those issues and the condition of change. How do we prevent that? The best thing is really to work with intact ecosystems to protect those. One of the big problems for forested ecosystems is illegal logging. Depending on where you look in the world, illegal logging can be between 20 to 98% of all timber that's harvested from forest blocks within countries. And it's estimated that illegal logging is valued at about $30 billion a year. It's not only the economic cost, but it also leads to conflict, loss of income for forest-dwelling communities, carbon issues, and a range of other environmental problems. Outside, it is alongside the arms trade and people smuggling in terms of economic impact. The problem with illegal logging is it's pretty complicated. So if this is a typical supply chain for timber, you go from a forest on the left-hand side right through to a customer on the right-hand side. But you might go through a processing plant, you might go through an export and import, and at any point in that supply chain, illegally logged products could be introduced. So when you're buying timber as a customer, and it might be certified by a very reputable organisation, you don't really know whether an illegally logged product has made its way into that supply chain. But technology can really help with that, and particularly the application of DNA and chemical methods. It's also in programs like CSI. We understand that DNA can potentially help with these, particularly in human criminal cases. So I'm just going to give you some examples now of how they can be applied to control illegal logging. And there's a couple of different elements to think about with illegal logging. The first one is that we can actually apply DNA fingerprinting methods to identify an individual forest product and which tree that product came from. This was a case that we did recently. Maple, which grows naturally along the northwest coast of the US. It's a high-value timber. It's used in guitars. It's used because of the very nice patterning that you get from the timber. Grows in old-growth forests and is common in the national parks along that west coast. This is pretty much the full range of maple from south of Canada right down to the north of California. And we were contacted by the US Forest Services to say that they'd had a piece of timber that was seized from a timber yard, and they suspected it came from a tree in a national park. So as part of this work, we constructed a genetic map, looked at the genetic variation of maple right across its natural range. We then used DNA fingerprinting methods to look at the difference between those individuals and between those populations. So we screened some 430 individuals from 40 populations using 135 different gene markers. Now, looking at the individualization, so that's the probability that two trees would be the same, have the same genotype, just at random. The probability of that is 1 times 10 to the 23. So there are more stars in the universe than the probability that two individuals would have the same genotype. I mean, there's only 3 trillion trees on Earth. So in effect, it's impossible that two individuals would have the same genotype by accident within this particular sampling. So what we did is this is the lockup yard. This is one of the US Forest Service officers. And we actually matched the DNA profile of that particular piece of timber back to a tree that was felled in the national park in Washington State, an exact match. And that evidence was used to prosecute the mill owner and 4 associates that had been sourcing illegally sourced timber within the region, and they received fines and jail sentences based on that evidence. I must emphasize that the DNA evidence wasn't the only evidence. There was a substantial case against the defendants within this particular case, but it's the first time that DNA evidence has been used to support a case of illegal logging within the US on US soil. So that's how we can help defend natural forests. Can we use these kind of techniques in supply chains to understand whether timber is systematically coming through supply chains and what kind of timber it is, whether it's being mixed, whether it comes from multiple sources. This is another example we looked at with teak in Myanmar. Now, there were problems in Myanmar with the north of Myanmar and the east. There are conflict zones, and the concern, particularly of European markets, is that teak coming out of those conflict zones is being used to support local military organisations within that region, hence promoting the conflict in those areas. So we used DNA methods to identify where the teak came from in Myanmar. Now, just the matching there, just quickly on the genotype profile, we have sawn timber, logs, and stumps. We actually tracked individual logs along the supply chain and then sampled them and resampled them at different points in the supply chain. So if there was a mixing of that particular product or an interruption within that supply chain, what we would see is different genotypes for those individuals along the supply chain. But we don't see that. We see the sawn timber, log, and stump. We see that's the same genotype. And those are two different individuals, and so hence their genotypes should be different. So for this case, this is now being used to support the export of teak going into Europe, who are very concerned about this origin. So I went through those cases in quite a bit of detail. We're using these types of methods for a range of other areas. This is sandalwood in Australia. There's strong genetic differences between South Australia and Western Australia, where sandalwood naturally grows. And so these methods are being used to distinguish between interstate trading, where fraud happens for sandalwood here in Australia. This is another set of examples. This is the species origin. We developed a series of tests that allow us to understand where oak comes from. So is it Asian oak, North American, Eurasian, or Europe? And this was oak sampled in the UK, and the origin was labelled as US white oak, but less than half of that oak sold in the UK as US white oak was actually from the US. And this is in spite of some of this oak having certification standards claiming that it came from a sustainable source. Now, we've also been working with other complex areas, mega diverse areas. This is a project that's currently underway in Indonesia with the Meranti group. There are more than 200 species in the Dipterocarpaceae family, which Meranti is common in. But this is the main mixed timber species that comes into Australia. And we have a good genetic test to be able to differentiate between these species that's now being applied by the Australian government for imports coming into Australia. But there's still a way to go. This is our knowledge of the geographic origin, or DNA tests that can prove DNA and isotope tests that can prove geographic origin. And the blue bars are where we have the tests, and the grey bars where there's no tests. So there's still quite a long way to go for the top 250 tree species to really be able to develop this type of information so that we can better police these timber supply chains. An important part of this consideration is that legislation has now come into play that makes it illegal to import illegally sourced timber from in a range of countries. So Australia has that legislation, the EU, the US, and Canada does. So these methods can be applied to support legislation and then prosecute importers that don't comply with that legislation. And we've been working with a company based in Singapore, Double Helix Tracking Technologies, where there's a value train, a docket that accompanies these shipments. This QR code shows you where the timber comes from. It can be traced back to source, and if it's a risky consignment, we'll have a DNA test to prove the validity of the claim. treatment. So once we have those problems, how do we help restore some of the ecosystems that we've degraded? Various estimates would say that about a third of all the land area is in some form degraded. And if you look at that globally, it's pretty much spread across the world. Often it's in the more semi-arid locations, the orange blocks here. But if you were to group all those areas together and put them into one landmass, let's call it the Federated States of Degradia, just for now, that land of degraded area would be larger than Russia and would actually be inhabited by 3 billion of the poorest and most vulnerable people. So land degradation is often linked with social and economic problems across the globe. So what can we do about that? Well, tree planting has caught the imagination of a range of intergovernment organisations as a potential way to help restore some of this degraded land. Now, the commitments and goals that have been established are still relatively modest compared to the total degraded land area. So we're talking about 2 billion hectares of degraded land, and some of the goals are still only around 500 million. But we're starting to get there with these types of goals, and the recognition that restoration of these areas is important. So if we do want to plant trees, where should we start planting these trees? This was another piece of work, again done by Jean-Francois Bastin, who's a collaborator of ours on a number of projects. And interestingly, they looked at the potential forest areas across the world. So that's the top map there. So the blue areas are where you get 100% forest cover right through to 0%. So based on rainfall, soils, climate, you can predict whether you should get a forest and good tree cover. Then they subtracted all those areas where there was agricultural land or there were cities, and they came up with the area down the bottom. So the graph at the bottom, which really highlights those areas that could support forest, which currently don't support forest. So these are areas around the globe where if you wanted to do reforestation, plant trees, this would be a good place to start. And as we can see, there's areas right around, particularly on the peripheries of rainforest areas, on the peripheries of desert areas, and particularly arid areas as well. And many of these locations would stop the current environmental degradation that's occurring in desert areas and desertification areas. If you were to plant all of these areas, it would be 1 trillion hectares, which would actually lock up 200 gigatons of carbon over the next 40 to 100 years. And that's more carbon than all the carbon that we've released to date from the Industrial Revolution. So this type of tree planting can really go a long way to offset a range of impacts, including our carbon footprint on the planet. But it's not just about planting trees. Coming back to those ecosystem services that I spoke at the start, why don't we plant to support ecosystem services? So don't just put back biodiversity, put back biodiversity and ecosystem services. Some of the simple ones: water purification, pollination services, carbon sequestration, soil health, and even human health, and I'll come on to that. But it does need to be a balance, and often there's a balance in landscapes between production landscape, the biodiversity within the landscape, and the new economies which can be around ecosystem services, such as carbon. But I wanted to take one particular ecosystem service and look at that in more detail. Pollination services. We know there's a decline in bees globally. It's a complex relationship. It's loss of habitat, it's increasing usage of pesticides, it's pests and diseases like varroa mite. All of these have contributed to what we call the Great Global Bee Decline. But we have a large number of pollination-dependent crops, apples, pears, lucerne, all the berries, all the nice fruit and veg you get to eat are actually pollination-dependent. So if we continue with the decline in bees, we're going to have a big problem with our food production. This is a project that was funded by the Agri-Futures and supported by Horticulture Innovation Australia, but also supported by a large number of producer organisations here in South Australia, but also nationally as well. And we asked the question, can you secure crop pollinations through revegetation strategies? We worked with growers, we worked with apple and pear growers, we worked with lucerne seed, and we also worked in canola production areas as well, and almonds. And so the question was, what is the best plants that you can put back into that landscape that will support both honeybees and native bees and bring back those pollination services within that landscape? We actually, to do this, you look at what species are there, so the native species pool. Do they provide pollen and nectar resources for the bees? Do they flower at the right time? Are they overlapping? You don't want too many species flowering all at the same time. You want a good food source year-round. Can you plant them in the location? How easy are they to grow in a nursery? And are they going to be complementary for the crop? So looking at those different filters, we were able to come up with a recommended list of what native plants to plant out through the Adelaide region, also through the Adelaide Hills and into the Murray-Darling Basin that are going to complement pollination-dependent cropping in those particular regions. And these recommendations are being planted out now to support pollination services within those particular cropping areas. But it does come on to this question of how we manage these systems. So if you take a typical landscape, is it just a cropping landscape? Is it just an urban landscape? Or is it just a biodiversity landscape? And typically with our landscapes now, it's a balance between those. But we also have these essential ecosystem services which these landscapes now need to support. Carbon, water quality, pollination, soil quality, pest and weed control, and even human health. The problem is it costs quite a lot of money to put plantings back into the landscape. So a simple monoculture will cost about $2,000 a hectare, but a biodiverse planting will cost about $20,000 per hectare to put that mixture of species back into the landscape. And the problem is that the carbon credits you get from those plantings just can't allow you to afford to do that type of planting. But if you're able to stack the benefits, so you get a carbon planting, you get a grant for biodiversity restoration, and you bring pollination resources back into the landscape, then you get to a level where it's cost effective to start doing this type of planting. And it doesn't need to be one type of planting in one location. Hedgerows around pollination-dependent crops would be a different planting from those around livestock that might provide shelter belts, would be different from those around watersheds that would improve and keep soil integrity, so you improve the quality of water. And we need to look in more detail at these economic returns because they provide the driver for change and the driver for action within the landscape. And certainly through the pollination work, it is cost effective to do these types of plantings around pollination dependent crops. So let's engineer for those ecosystem services. I didn't mention too much about human health. I mean, we do get a benefit from spending time in nature. We feel good about nature. We get fresh air. Often it's connected with a run or some kind of physical exercise, so you get that physical benefit. But we also get exposure to microbiome, and that's the microbes that live in nature. They live on the surface of the leaves. They live in the soil. So every time you walk into nature, you're getting a microbiome shower. You're getting showered in microbiota. Now, that might sound pretty disgusting, particularly in a time of COVID, where we probably don't want too much microbiome going on. But it's really essential that we're actually exposed to that kind of microbiota because it challenges our immune system and allows a healthy development of our immune system. When we live in urban environments, concrete environments with no exposure to green space, we get a much reduced exposure to microbiota and we're not getting those health benefits. So there's a whole range of ecosystem services that we're just discovering the benefits of that we need to start engineering our habitats for. So what can you do? What can you do based on this talk? It might sound very nice and interesting. You might be motivated to think about things for at least a couple of minutes after the talk. Well, you can go and plant a tree. So that's everybody should go and plant a tree. Trees are good. They grow with you. You could plant one for your children. You could plant a tree. You could actually be part of community groups that do tree planting. There are really good community groups here in South Australia and in Australia where you get the social benefit as well. So Trees for Life, Greening Australia, and you're probably going to get some advice on which trees to plant, whether they fit with the ecosystem, getting some kind of reduction. But you can also change some of your practices. I realise we haven't been doing much air travel this year, but ticking boxes around reduction of carbon impact, air travel and other types of industries. This is the money that comes out of these industries into these large-scale restoration and planting projects. This is where the capital comes from to fund these large-scale reforestation projects. And also things like making choices of where your timber comes from, signing up to Nature's Barcode or other systems that really are able to eliminate illegally logged timber products from supply chains. So you can do something, and there are some simple places to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Now, I'd like to invite you to remain on camera to start the Q&A. And remember to submit your questions via the Q&A section of the webinar. But I'm going to start with a pre-submitted question, and this is from Cecilia. How is the data used to protect sensitive environments, environmental areas, and influence government decisions to protect our environment?
Thanks, Cecilia. Yeah, look, that's a good question. And it goes back to the start of the talk. We were talking about the network that had been set up through the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. So for that kind of network, there are certain example sites that are monitored for their condition over time. And that information comes back, it's then evaluated, has there been an increase in weeds in that particular population? Have we seen a change in the ecosystem? Is it moving from a treed ecosystem to a grassy ecosystem, which might have been a fire that came through? Are we seeing an increase in fire? And this type of information, and there's a range of other environmental monitoring information which comes forward from different processes. Some of that is collected up, and there's a 5-year publication, State of the Environment, that's published federally. And so a lot of that information is gathered up into that type of report, but that is every 5 years. But there are other more active processes that are underway. And I would say that remote sensing is now being increasingly used, first of all, to spot fires. It's being used to look at the impact of drought, where you get a browning off, a reduction in productivity. But also, in some cases, you can actually track invasion fronts of weeds using that type of information. So I would say we're becoming much more sophisticated in the type of information that we gather, and we're becoming much more coordinated in gathering that information and feeding it through into action and policy. I'd say we've probably got quite good environmental policies here within Australia for protection. It's getting the information through into action that's the key issue.
Thank you, Andy. Now, obviously, there's a lot of data that you're collecting with your work, and there's a question here from Melinda. Are there opportunities for big data analysts to assist in these developments?
Sounds like somebody wants a job. So I would say, yes, there are. And yeah, if you fancy a job, just send me an email. We are after data analysts. There are increasingly complex data streams that are coming forward into these types of decisions. I talked a bit about the remote sensing information. I mean, that's, gigabytes of information that's rendered down. Often it's simplified. We use processes like machine learning and computer analysis really to simplify that large amount of information down, really to look for the key change parameters. You're getting large amounts of genomic information, which is now being used to screen watercourses, soil profiles, to pick up rare and endangered species, whether there's an increase in pathogens coming through in those particular areas. And there are a large number of kind of remote sensors, and increasing numbers that are being put out. I mean, we talk about the Bureau of Meteorology and the weather station systems that they have around Australia. Well, that's nothing compared to the kind of plethora of small, cheap sensors that are now being deployed into our landscapes. So, of course, the Bureau of Meteorology, the weather station is the gold standard for measuring temperature, humidity, and all those kind of parameters. But these cheap, smaller sensors, whilst not quite so accurate, you can deploy them right across the landscape. So you're getting much more information on the variability that occurs across that landscape. So, yeah, and data scientists, they're needed to combine all this information together, make sense of it, analyze those trends and changes, visualize those trends, and therefore understand and take action based on the information that's coming in.
Thanks, Andy. Now, you touched on human health a couple of times in your presentation. We have a good question from Patty here. Do you think that not engaging nature can affect our health?
Thanks, Patty. I think yes. My answer would definitely be yes. And there's a few good reasons for that. I mean, don't get me started on my kids on their phones. Just don't get me started. But what benefits do you get from actually going out into nature? First of all, you get a physical benefit. You walk, you get an engagement, and you often feel psychologically better from being in a green space. There's been a couple of recent studies that really have documented improvement in well-being, improvement in kind of psychological condition based on just being exposed to green space, outside green space, rather than not. And at a time of where we've had isolation, we've had a range of living inside for a large number of people across the globe, including here in Australia. That's time to spend outside. In some places, you're only allowed an hour to go outside for exercise or to go down the shops. It's critical that everybody takes the opportunity to use that to go outside. But the other thing I just mentioned briefly is this more physical assistance and support we get. There's something called the old friends hypothesis, and so humans, we evolved in the dirt. We've only recently become sophisticated, and now we're paranoid about cleaning everything, cleaning our hands. But 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, we ate food, didn't really matter where it came from. And we'd ingest much more in terms of microbiota in our diet. We'd be exposed to that. We'd be living outdoors much more. And so our exposure to that microbiome was part of how we evolved as a species. So we've become used to being exposed to that microbiome. So the good microbiota test and challenge our immune system and improve our immune system so that then we can fight off challenges from more pathogenic microbes. And so that's why they're called old friends, because we kind of need those. We need those to challenge our system. So getting outside, particularly as kids, you get introduced to these old friends, these non-pathogenic microbes that help with the development of our immune system. Now that is a cutting-edge research area. Some of those linkages haven't fully been made, but hey, there's so many other benefits from going outside that I think it's a pretty safe suggestion to be able to spend time in nature.
Well, there we are. We now know what we need to be doing to feel a bit healthier. Now I'm going to move to some live questions, if I may. I've got one from Helen here. Are you considering the enormous potential of regenerative agriculture to draw down carbon dioxide, as soil carbon?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I think if we look at the issues facing the planet, it's no longer a case that we can just preserve biodiversity in national parks. We have to look at how our production landscapes can help contribute to some of the recovery of the systems and the problems that we're seeing. Regenerative agriculture is an interesting concept. It's basically moving away from intensive agriculture. It's moving away from the use of fertilizer and pesticides. It probably accepts that you're going to get a decrease in production levels, but the overall inputs are going to be decreased. So your profits will increase overall. Much more diversified system, allowing for nature strips around the properties that actually encourage things like pollination services, and they also encourage the natural predators of disease and pest organisms within those landscapes. So you can reduce pesticide applications and returning soil health and carbon sequestration. So in theory, regenerative agriculture definitely has a part to play. The only problem is, in my mind, is that there isn't, so that there could probably be some more scientific basis to regenerative agriculture. It's not really fad-driven and guru-led, but I guess it is. There's not really, this is how you do regenerative agriculture. You tend to have some people that have had some really good wins and, profiling regenerative agriculture that works well, but then it may not be transferable to another system. So I think probably what we'd like to see is a broader testing and understanding of what works well with regenerative agriculture, and then a broader application into our agricultural systems.
Now I'm just going to let everyone know we have got a little bit of time for some more questions if you'd like to send them through, but I have one here from Dan. We are in NAIDOC week. What can we learn from the traditional owners of the land?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I'm sorry I didn't include that within my talk. I think obviously the traditional owners, indigenous communities here within Australia have had a very intertwined history with the land on which they live. I think some of the, particularly the fire regimes, the support of those, the timing of fire, and we talk about those in terms of cultural burnings as well. It's really important, and I think we've moved away from that more traditional indigenous and cultural land management to a land management that isn't necessarily timed in with the regenerative capacity of the landscapes. So some of those may have led to inappropriate fire regimes coming in more recently into our landscapes that then hinder the recovery and regeneration of those landscapes. The other real opportunity, I think, that we need to recognise is with native foods here within Australia. Can I ask you a question, Laura? Which is the only Australian native food that's been globally taken up and domesticated? Do you know? Can you name one natural one?
Well, Andy, that's putting me on the spot. I think I'm going to have to let you answer that.
Sorry, I should have done that. So quite unfair. Usually I'd pick on somebody in the audience, but we don't have an audience here today. So, macadamia nut. Macadamia nut is the key one. But apart from macadamia nut, we're not seeing any other plants that have really gone global in terms of their recognition or development of crops. Whereas, from every other continent on Earth, you've got, potatoes from South America, you've got sunflowers from North America, you've got, broccoli and cabbage from the south of Europe, you've got rice from Asia, cassava from Africa. You've got all of these crops, and you haven't had this recognition and exploration of native foods here in Australia like you've had elsewhere in the world. So I think part of the ecosystem services and the recognition is what native foods can Australia really help develop and then bring to the world. And that has to be done through Indigenous led partnership. It has to be done in a culturally appropriate way. But that is a really big opportunity that I think we're currently missing.
Well, that's a really excellent point to end on. So I'd like to finish now by thanking tonight's speaker, Professor Andy Lowe, for the insightful and really interesting presentation. And thank you to you all for viewing and for your questions and comments. This is our last Research Tuesdays for the year. On behalf of Research Tuesdays team and the university, I want to thank you all for sticking with us through this very challenging year. We really appreciate your support and kind words, and we'll look forward to working towards restoring physical events in the new year. We'll be back in February 2021, and the programme will be released in the coming weeks. Be sure to sign up for our mailing list to receive the latest information. Thank you for tuning in once again, and we hope to see you next time. Good night.